Welcome to On Our Minds. I'm Dr. Brenda Wilson,
And Dr. Russ Witcher.
and we are two journalism professors here at Tennessee Tech. On this podcast, we sit down with other faculty and talk academics, personal interests, and teaching experiences. On Our Minds today, we're talking with Dr. Troy Smith from Tennessee Tech's History Department, and officially our first return guest. So welcome back.
Thank you. What an honor. I get invited once to a lot of things, but I rarely get invited twice.
And today we're going to be talking about an interesting class that you teach over in the history department, the history of comic books. Can you tell us how you got interested in that topic and sort of the background there?
Well, I got interested in comic books as a kid, liking comic books. I was really into them since before I could read. But so far as the class and looking at it from an academic, scholarly perspective, actually, it's a little bit of a story. When I was in grad school, that's kind of draining on your mind. And I remember at the end of my first semester, to refresh my mental palate, I started reading through my old Master of Kung Fu comics. And I started noticing certain themes, not just in the comics, but in the letters pages inside them. And, it coincided with some of the things that I was studying about the history of race. And then that just got me interested in looking at it from a totally different perspective than I had before as a fan.
Last time you were on, you mentioned a book. Is it Shaolin?
Shaolin Brew.
Yeah, and I was just reading the blurb about it that the blaxploitation and kung fu movies encouraged comic publishers to follow suit.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that history.
First of all, the title, Shaolin Brew, is the title of a Wu-Tang Clan song. And that is a perfect blending of African American and Asian American culture right there. Because their name comes from a Kung Fu movie, Wu-Tang Clan, and Shaolin Temple associated with Kung Fu. So just the short answer to your question, African Americans, Asians, and Asian Americans represented in comics ever since comics came out in the 30s, comic books, but always as the sidekick or the comic relief. Sometimes by the 60s as a supporting hero, but never as the headliner of a comic book. And then in the early 70s, when you had Shaft, Bad Mother Hush Your Mouth, and other blaxploitation films, and Bruce Lee, and the popularity of those Kung Fu films, that really both of them did well with a wide audience, that encouraged comics publishers to go out on a limb to try to make a buck, cash in on this fad, and actually have people of color as the main character in a comic book, with a comic book that's titled after them. And that had not really happened before it had gotten close. And so that's kind of where my insertion area into the topic, although in the book I look back all the way to the 30s and bring us up to the 70s, and I talk a lot about the 70s, and then I bring us to the present.
Okay.
And so I was looking at the syllabus for this class. It looks very interesting. The required texts are graphic novels. Is that just, I don't know the history. Of course you do. Did comic books then evolve into graphic novels, or were they compiled into them? How are they? They're not one and the same. So tell us, I guess, the distinction.
Comic books, which are generally periodicals, magazines that come out on a regular basis, were first introduced in the mid-1930s. And the first year or two, they just reprinted comic strips. And within a couple of years, they were making original material. So far as a graphic novel, that is technically a self-contained novel in comic book form, in sequential graphic form.
The illustrations.
And the first thing that came close to that came out in 1950 by Matt Baker, and it was just a one-shot mystery thing, and it didn't really go anywhere. But then in the late 70s, a couple of different people started doing these things for the purpose of them being self-contained and tell a single story. And probably Will Eisner, who was just foundational in the early comic book industry and comic strips. If you've ever heard of The Spirit, he's the guy that created The Spirit. Did the first thing that advertised itself as a graphic novel. It was called A Contract with God. It came out in 1977. And it was a series of stories set in the New York City Jewish neighborhood he grew up in, there and in Poughkeepsie at the summer camp. And it was just, it wasn't characters that had appeared before or ever appeared again. It was a single interconnected story. So what they often do today is comic books, they will sometimes re-release in a format that looks like a graphic novel. It's bound several issues together. Those are sometimes called graphic novels. For me, as a purist, I refer to those as collections because it is part of a serial, ongoing thing, and you're not getting the whole story.
Okay. Yeah, that's how I imagined it to begin with, was that it was similar to what a fiction writer might introduce a serial and then the book. You're saying sometimes it's that and sometimes not.
Yes. In fact, over the last 20 years, as comic books in their actual original format are not sold that much. You have to go to specialty stores to get them. There's not as many buyers, but people still like to read the single album full of them. So even Marvel and DC, their storylines over the last few years have evolved to be like 5 or 6 parts, 5 or 6 issues, and then they end that story and start another one to make it easier to release them in that graphic novel form in bookstores, so that readers don't pick up and there's some dangling subplot that they don't know anything about. So it's changed the format of even how they do the comic books.
Oh, okay.
I was looking at your syllabus for your course about the history of comic strips and comic books, and early in the course you mentioned the rise of the comic strip. Well, as journalists, it's a very important part of our history too, with yellow journalism and how it got its name. A lot of people, of course, refer to it as the Yellow Kid, but it's actually Hogan's Alley.
Character.
And I guess I was wanting to know, I know there was the Katzenjammer Kids around that time, but was this the first really big comic strip in terms of prominence?
Yes, Hogan's Alley was the first big hit. And part of that was because it wasn't in a local paper, it was syndicated because, Hearst and Pulitzer had control over so many newspapers, and they were in competition with one another for artists to have syndication. There were a handful of regular comic strips starting in the early 1890s, about 5 years before the Hogan's Alley started, but they were just in one paper. So the fact that that sort of convergence of it coming at a time when you had people in the newspaper business that were inserting a material across many cities kind of enabled there to be that popularity of that comic book. And then the fact that, usually they were black and white in the dailies, but sometimes the Yellow Kid's gown would be yellow and kind of catchy.
Yeah.
Eye-catching. Looking at the syllabus for your class too, that class examines how comic books and graphic novels parallel the contemporary events. It says historical events, American culture. Talk about some of the themes that you cover in that course.
Well, I can give you a good example to demonstrate what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So you guys are familiar with Superman. Superman created by Simon and Schuster, Joe Simon and Jerry Schuster, who were both the children of Jewish immigrants. If you look at most of the superheroes created in the 1930s and 40s, most of the creators were Jewish, and specifically second generation Jewish, whose parents had been from Central or Eastern Europe, part of that new immigration wave starting in the late 1800s through the 1920s, right? So there was a strong affinity for a defender of the defenseless, right, with the memory of the mistreatment in the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you think about Superman, he's a character who, as a baby, his parents put him in this little vessel and sent him forward. And he was found by someone else and was raised in an identity that was not really his own, but later he became the defender of everybody. And who is that?
Mm-hmm.
What does that sound like from the Bible?
Yeah, Moses.
Moses,
Mhm.
yeah. So that is, I couldn't get away with using this as a title, but there was a rabbi that wrote a book about the history of Superman called Up, Up, and Oy Vey.
Oh.
And there's several books about the Jewish connections, but it wasn't just him. Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Mm-hmm.
Jack Kirby's real name was actually Jacob Kurtzberg.
Hmm.
So a lot of them Stanley Lieber
Mm-hmm.
changed it. His parents were Romanian Jewish immigrants. So something specific about that time and place in New York City
Mm-hmm.
with that group of people was translated into kind of the foundational parts, not just the business end, but the creative end of something that has come to really dominate our culture. So that's one good example of just how the immigration stuff going on, the FDR New Deal stuff going on at that time, the fact that, scary Nazi stuff was happening, all that converged to define what these characters were like at that time. And then you can find similar things in other time periods.
One thing I'm looking here also on your syllabus is the Great Comic Scare.
Yes.
Now, there's kind of a local connection to that too, because it was the Kefauver Committee that was after these juvenile delinquents. Tell a little bit about that history.
Well, by the late 1940s, there were a lot of people saying that comic books were bad for kids' minds and they were trashy. And that was accelerated by the fact that in the late 1940s, horror comics like Tales from the Crypt and crime comics became really popular. And some of them were fairly graphic in their description of violence. And the really big motivating factor here that got the public engaged was there was this psychiatrist, German-born psychiatrist, Frederick Wertham, who worked with juvenile delinquents in New York City. And he noticed every juvenile delinquent he knew read comic books.
Oh.
So therefore, comic books caused, he could as easily have said bicycles caused juvenile delinquency because all the kids read them, right?
Yeah.
In fact, Carol Tilley, a friend of mine at the University of Illinois, did her dissertation about retracing Wertham's experiments and his notes and discovered that he made up about half of that stuff. Just the statistics that he used. But he presented things in such a way that this is going to warp your children's mind. He was worried about Wonder Woman making little girls, turning them gay, and Batman and Robin. He had a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
And it just sort of coincided at a time, with the Red Scare, with the blacklisting going on, where everything was perceived as a communist plot to weaken the morals of the nation, especially the youth, right? And so this tied in with that. And so there wound up being congressional hearings held about comic books in which, they had big poster blow-ups of covers and individual pictures from the comics. And it resulted in censorship and a lot of professionals going out of business.
Was this the creation of the Comic Code?
The Comics Code Authority, yes. So basically, the industry was given the option of creating some kind of self-censoring body or else. And so that's what they came up with. You had this little stamp, a picture of a stamp really, that had to be in the upper right-hand corner of a comic book for it to be sold on newsstands. And it had to pass through the censors, and the censors were very specific about what was allowed. Crime could never pay. The bad guy could never get away with it. There could be no adultery. There could be no making fun of authority figures. There could be no vampires, werewolves, witches, zombies, the words horror, the word terror. No alcohol or drug use even alluded to. And if you read old comic books, you will notice that in the 50s, they got really bland.
Yeah. It happened with movies about, 20 years later with the Motion Picture Association.
And then music.
Yes.
Yeah, music,
So is that why we go from the golden age to the silver age and beyond? Or?
But pretty much that period ended what's called the golden age. And then there was sort of like this a few years where it was like no age at all because not much
Right.
was happening. And then there was a little bit of a resurgence. That's why they call it the Silver Age.
Mm-hmm.
That brought back some of that stuff, but within the constraints. However, in the early 70s, both Marvel and DC had a couple of storylines involving drug abuse.
Hmm.
In fact, Stan Lee said that he was requested from various agencies to have something showing the dangers
Mm-hmm.
of drug abuse, and they refused to give them the approval to have these stories. Peter Parker's roommate Harry Osborn became a heroin addict and had a horrible time. So they released them anyway, and it was Spider-Man, so people bought it, and that kind of broke the power of the code a little bit. After that, they loosened their grip
Yeah.
quite a bit.
They could see how exploring certain themes might also have a benefit rather than just.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And there's I'm sorry, I didn't mean
Yeah.
to cut you off.
No, no.
but a really great story, it might take me a minute to tell,
Mhm.
really encapsulates this whole thing. There was a story that had appeared in EC Comics. They're the ones that made Tales from the Crypt, and they had a bunch of sci-fi stories.
Mhm.
They originally released it, I think, in 1952 or so. It was called Judgment Day. There's a little science fiction story about an astronaut from Earth, and he's wearing his astronaut helmet, so you can't see his face, goes to this planet of robots to see whether they can join the Federation of civilized planets, basically. And you got orange robots and blue robots, and he discovers that even though they're the same kind of robot, just painted differently, the blue ones are segregated and are given demeaning jobs, aren't given as the same depth of programming. And then the orange robot is like, you're talking to me like, I should, I'm responsible for this. I can't help it, right? And so the astronaut refuses to let them join. And then he gets in his spaceship. In the last picture, he takes his helmet off and he's black.
Wow.
Hmm.
So that's a powerful story. When it first came out, it was very critically acclaimed. Then after these censorship things, they needed a quick filler story because the censors had denied one of their stories. So they ran this one again, but this was after the Comics Code. And the censors were not going to let them run it because it was a black guy and Southerners might be offended.
Oh boy.
And then they
They
were like,
missed
well,
the
okay, you
point,
can
didn't
show
they?
him, but you can't have the teardrop in his eye.
Hmm.
You got to take that out. So William Gaines, who was the publisher of EC, basically told them what they could do with themselves and published it anyway. And then what he did was he just canceled all his comic books except for one. There was one that was a humor comic book called Mad.
Mm-hmm.
And he
Yeah.
turned that into a black and white magazine.
Mad magazine.
Which means it could not be censored by the comic book authority because it wasn't sold on the comics racks. It was with the regular magazines, and it was a huge success.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at the syllabus and it doesn't really have dates attached as it goes, from golden to silver on, on this.
yes.
But I'm just wondering I guess the impact of mass media. I'm sure television may have had a role in that, but now with movies, it seems like that's really picked up the comic book themes, and there've been so many blockbusters, and for a decade or more now, it seems like every movie has some relation to one or the other comic empires. I don't know, publishing companies. Tell us a little bit, I guess, about how. I mean, from your perspective, do you talk about that much in your
yes.
class?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we also talk a lot about mythology
Mm-hmm.
because this is the modern American mythology. If
Mhm.
you go to the movies now, there's superhero movies everywhere, just like there were westerns everywhere
Right.
in the 1950s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
The cowboy was the classic American mythology, and I believe it has shifted
Mm-hmm.
from the cowboy to the superhero,
Mm-hmm.
actually.
Yeah, I mean, I teach a magazine class, and we talk about how all media have to sort of reinvent themselves
Mhm.
as new media are introduced. And so I was just sort of wondering, maybe this is a better way of asking the question: is how has that been a factor with comic books and that medium?
So the characters in comic books have become properties,
Uh-huh.
intellectual properties, more so than characters in a comic book.
Mm-hmm.
Kids don't read comic books. Only old codgers like me,
Mhm.
mostly, who have the nostalgic attachment. But people love the characters and know the stories, and they associate them with the movies or video games
Mm-hmm.
that they've seen. So it's kind of this weird thing where there's still comic books being made, and some people follow them, and you can follow them digitally now.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to buy physical copies. But that's really not where that's kind of like this almost secondary forgotten aspect of it. It is the other media in which the characters are represented that is what is transferring knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of the characters and also defining the characters in a way, because what that means is that if you've noticed these movies, they restart the whole thing every few years.
Yeah,
Go
tell the
back to the
backstory.
new actor. The new actor tell the whole origin again, slightly
again.
different way. The reason for that is now that they are properties
Mm-hmm.
and not part of an ongoing, continuing story, readers have to immediately be able to figure out what's going on and who they are. So in the comics, they're no longer allowed to change and grow over time. They are kind of frozen in amber,
Mm-hmm.
like the Peanuts characters
Mhm.
in the comic strip, or like Bart Simpson, because they have to always now be in this situation, this position, because that's what people expect, because they only have seen these other properties,
Mm-hmm.
which is sad because there used to be, I mean, these are comic books, but they were sequential and they went on for a long time. And you could have something like I've always been a big Spider-Man fan.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you follow him, he's in high school when it starts, and you follow him through college, and then he goes into grad school, washes out of grad school, gets married, becomes a high school science teacher. You know, things are happening. He's changing, and changing as a person somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
But then all of that, once the movies started being the main focus, the comic book started restarting everything and rebooting everything every few years to keep it in that one cycle, which is kind of sad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The United States of America has some of the best institutions of higher education in the world. People come from countries all over the world to study here. We'd like to think the faculty are a big part of what makes our colleges and universities so attractive. Most academics spend their entire careers studying their chosen field and its many facets, while others may focus on one particular part of a topic and go in depth to learn all they can about the specifics. You may ask, why? Why would someone devote their life to studying a certain field? On this podcast, we're asking that too. We're also just having a good time getting to know the interesting people on campus we wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to chat with. We're talking with our colleagues about their chosen fields of study, how they got interested in the subject, and what they've discovered about it so far. We hope you find our discussions as interesting as we find our fellow academics. Some topics we discuss overlap the general education courses all students getting a college degree take, while other topics are in subjects students take in upper level courses for their major. And some topics are even more specific than that. You may not study them unless you're getting an advanced degree. So listen closely. What we talk about may be on the quiz.